we hold these truths so we can sell them to the highest bidder, cloak our bad behavior and religion, then accuse the citizens of being sinners. It ought to be self-evident that we all fall short of the glory. And this is the American story, frozen. Toys and turkeys for the poor, tools and trades for the chosen. All men are created equal, yet in America, oppression has an annual sequel. Endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, but then unprincipled children turn the creator's theater into an octagon of ultimate fights. Life, liberty, and the pursuit. It ought to apply to the old and the youth, but we have to plant seeds of knowledge if that's what we want to produce. 1971 is the year I was born. 1972, America was torn, split on the issues of the war in Vietnam. We needed rubber trees for our cars, and Firestone could continue to grease their dirty little palms. 48 years later, I was sworn in as the first African-American county clerk of Champaign County and Illinois. But in truth, that bounty was produced from 1961 to 1972 when the youth, African-American and Caucasian, began a campaign of truth and persuasion. Now, the civil rights movement paved the way with its commitment and success. It gave the students a chance to finally understand that they had to move beyond suggest, because power concedes nothing without a demand.
It's interesting to think about the question of scale in political action. And I know a lot of folks can get discouraged because they would say, why would just my one little act make any kind of difference? I think history shows us that small steps do make a big difference, that a few folks coming together at the right time, who didn't know it was the right time, who maybe didn't even see the significance of that time until years and years later, actually ended up being an example for many other folks.
In 1971, Aaron Ammons was born and would later become the first African-American county clerk for Champaign County. During that same time, students at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign were organizing for their right to vote in Champaign County. A graduate student, Jim Young, was one of the key organizers of this movement. The intersection of Jim Young and Aaron Ammons was almost 50 years in the making.
When I learned about this important period in the 70s, what I thought of was the rise in student activism and understanding of and fluency in student power that had been here for 2 decades before. The fear of communist influence on the University of Illinois was in many ways what began a growing consciousness on campus that students might not have as much agency and power over their interaction with the university as they thought they needed. What really set a lot of the course here was something called the Claybaugh Act, where a state representative actually put some legislation in place that forbid student organizations that were involved in perceived communist sympathizing or activities to benefit from any aspect of university resources. Could not register as student organizations, could not use spaces, all these sorts of things. But it was the concern about free speech that was really the predecessor to students finding their voice here in many ways. That just got amplified when, say, local black activists encouraging some of these largely white students that were concerned about their free speech to also be looking out for the rights of their black neighbors started joining forces. So there was a lot of coalition building in the 60s especially here on campus.
At the time, it was the civil rights and black power movement as well as the anti-war movement. So you see a lot of cross-fertilization of movements. But the one constant is the role of youth and students in all of those.
Remember, these were young people in the civil rights movement. A lot of times the movements that get talked about, there's this either a misnomer or just people think that it had to be adults that was making these decisions, that were doing these things. And no, these were students, these were young people.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 teachers, ministers, lawyers, and students.
It's Bob Moses, the civil rights activist in 1964. He led the campaign to register African American voters. It was part of a movement, really, known as Freedom Summer, that brought activists around the country to the Deep South.
Amidst the Vietnam War, there were many efforts and legislation being proposed to reduce the voting age from 21 to 18. Our 18-year-old men were told to fight and die in the Vietnam War, and yet they were unable to have a voice in their democracy. On July 1st, 1971, the voting age was lowered to 18. This new demographic of voters accelerated many student organizations to ensure the newly qualified voters were registered.
In '72, there was a major election coming up. There was a movement nationally in 1970 to try and get students on campuses registered to vote, because there were millions of students at that point who were not registered.
Clerk Aaron Ammons regularly speaks at the University YMCA, teaching students about their important role in democracy. In October 2023, Aaron Ammons was speaking, and Jim Young was in attendance. For the first time, Aaron and Jim's paths crossed.
There's no way I couldn't show my appreciation for those efforts of those students in the early 70s, because it ultimately resulted in me becoming the first African-American county clerk in Champaign County, and the only one of two who was elected in the entire state of Illinois in 2018.
We had a sit-in in the courthouse. There were probably about 20 people who sat in, including myself and Keith Patton, who was the president of the organization. And the sheriff did not arrest anybody. He said, you know, you need to leave. We didn't leave. So essentially they just pulled us out of the office. And there were probably 300 or 400 people at the courthouse at that time, students waiting in line to register. And one of the sheriff's deputies must have been a little angry that nobody was arrested. So he decided to arrest two of us as we were leaving the building, myself and Lou Gold, who was a political science professor.
The students' demands could not be ignored. With pressure mounting, Bing removed his restrictions.
Dennis Bing decided to remain open until the last person who was in line got registered, and that turned out to be approximately 1,400 people. There were lines around the courthouse. It was amazing. Yeah, it was great. It was really great. The county board election was one of the main elections other than the primary. We had made up a list of 6 different issues that we wanted to see who would support those issues. The Democrats were willing to support all of the 6 issues that we were interested in, so they were endorsed.
My name is Laurel Pressing. I got asked in the 1970s to run for county board.
It was really the first time that students had been able to vote locally, and in any numbers anyway. And in the case of that county board election, all 9 of the Democrats in those 3 districts where a lot of students registered won. And I believe in 2 of the districts, the new votes made the difference.
I always say every vote counts, and I have a real good example of it, that I won my first election by 1 vote.
Laura Pressing was one of 3 women elected to the Champaign County Board. Prior to this time, no woman had ever been elected into this office. She would continue her work in politics as a state representative and eventually mayor of Urbana. During her time as mayor, Laurel intersected with then local organizer Aaron Ammons.
I don't know how I got to know him. I think it was a neighborhood group. So it seems like he had a talent for for helping people solve problems. So that's why I suggested that he go on into politics.
Laurel was mayor at the time that my wife was elected and moved on to state representative, and Laurel Pressing said, hey, if Aaron Ammons was to run for this seat, no one would beat him, he would win the seat, and for Ward 3, I would like to appoint him. At that time, I was still dealing with and had a felony conviction on my record. So I was not legally allowed to serve as an elected official at the municipal level. County government then and now allows a person with a felony conviction to serve, but at the municipal level, I could not.
He had a record as a young man, and I don't think that somebody who makes a mistake when they're a teenager should have to pay for it for the rest of their life.
At that time, Governor Pat Quinn was up for re-election. Unfortunately, Governor Quinn did not win, but the governor has the right to pardon. Well, Laurel Pressing and Governor Quinn had a close relationship, and she also reached out to him and said, hey, Aaron has done the work, and he would be able to serve on the Urbana City Council if you were to give him the pardon. And on the way out, I think I was the last name on the list, he pardoned me and lifted my felony conviction, which allowed me to serve. So that's kind of how I got pulled into this.
Aaron Ammons ran for and won county clerk in 2018, becoming the first Democrat in 76 years to hold that position. His victory was due in part to the student vote that the former clerk tried to restrict. The students' passion for exercising their right to vote was the same passion that led the students of the 70s to fight for and win the right to vote.
In the early 70s, there was just almost total opposition to students being able to register. Today, with Aaron Ammons being the county clerk, it's much more open. There'll be much more attempts to get everybody registered who wants to register.
I've watched people work here and be adamant that the students shouldn't have the right to vote where they go to school. Let them vote back where their home is or something, they say. Yet they don't take the same position for the snowbird who lives for 6 months in Florida and only 6 months here. Being in this office has taught me how voting rights and taxes come together. The whole idea of taxation without representation really comes to life for me now as the county clerk, and understanding elected officials are sort of parsing out and divvying up your resources, your tax dollars.
I have a lot of respect for the people that advocated so hard to earn student voting rights for me and people like me. The right to vote in itself is incredibly important, and so many people have sacrificed so much historically in this country to earn that right to vote, both in general and specifically for students. So, I mean, I would say thank you, because without them doing that work, I wouldn't be able to go to the polls in November.
I actually wasn't raised as someone who was encouraged to vote, and I became a real convert. I think the way I became a convert was seeing that my vote matters not only for how it influences an outcome, but for how it changes my relationship to my state, to my community. It makes me different. I come from art, I come from painting. When you make a painting, when you make a drawing, there are so many marks you put on that page, on that canvas, that you never see again because they're buried under there. They're underneath the paint. You erase them later, you change them, but you had to make them to get to the final picture. And that's true of every good painting and picture. There are countless marks in that you don't see that had to be there. And that's how I look at voting. It changes who I am as the painter, every brush stroke I make, and it changes who I am as a citizen every vote I take, even if it's not making an outcome that I can point to in some instrumental way.